Well, Frank, we're hearing from more and more church leaders who want to think outside the box when it comes to their facilities. And I think a lot of pastors have this long felt challenge around operating large buildings that aren't functionally used but once a week. And so they're looking for better ways to steward their resources, including their facilities. But before we jump in, could you tell us a little bit about your own story and how you got into the space, and then really how Phase came to be?
Sure. Tony, thanks for letting us have this time to hang out and spend some time together. I'm really grateful for that. Yeah. So at the end of the day, I was at a church called Elevation, big church in Charlotte, North Carolina. As you know, I was on the executive team there. We were building a couple of buildings a year, a couple of campuses a year, and we were using them once a week. And we were trying to be a good steward. So we would try to think through other ways to activate the space or engage the community. And we're sitting here doing this as far as feeling this tension at Elevation of going, we're building buildings and using them 7 hours a week. So we were the epitome of this. And we were still having kingdom impact. We were still baptizing people and finances were okay, but it was something's got to give. Is this really good stewardship? What does this look like?
Yep.
So that led to some conversations. I thought I was going to be like a board member or advisor. Ended up making the hardest decision of my life to leave staff at Elevation to come pursue this dream known as Phase Family Center, which was how do we do multi-use strategy and help give the infrastructure to the churches so they don't have to do this alone. So yes, this idea of multi-use is smart and it's great for stewardship. It's great for community impact, but it seems to struggle when churches just try to figure it all out by themselves as another thing to do. And so we opened our first location here in Alpharetta, 62,000 square foot facility, brand new facility, build out the operations, and then found a church to be a tenant of the space. And while we were building out that one, Mark Batterson up in DC called me and said, hey, I've ended up with the city block. He wrote a book called Circle Maker and talks about it in there. It said the mayor's declared a childcare crisis. We want to help meet this need. We don't know how. Could you help us? So before we had opened our first one, we were already working on our second one. And so it's been this cool opportunity to lean in on this space. Some of the things we've really learned to become experts in the space. Some we've just seen other churches do it really well. And there's a way to do multi-use well. There's also a way to do it very poorly that hopefully we get to discuss at some point today. But Phase was the birth of these different people wrestling with the same tensions and going, instead of just saying, gosh, there's got to be a better way, let's go figure it out.
All right. So, Frank, with that backstory, can you share more about maybe the history or context to the multi-use space trends that we're seeing more and more churches embrace today?
Yeah, for sure. And let me emphasize, multi-use is not new, right? We all know this, right? And so we had churches that were having schools in them or preschools or trying different stuff or event centers or sports or whatever it may be. This has gone on for a while, but as best I know, and Tony, you'd probably know the dates better than I would. You just have a better understanding of church history than I do. But somewhere, let's call it in the 80s, 90s, okay, not that long ago, there was this pursuit of excellence on Sunday morning. And let's get back to the fundamentals of what we're called to do. And a lot of this other stuff is a distraction. And one of the reasons it was deemed a distraction is because it wasn't having the impact they thought. It wasn't as good a stewardship as we thought. It wasn't excellent. Oftentimes it was good, but not great. And so you had all these activities, learning centers and partnerships with nonprofit programs and sports facilities and workout facilities. And the idea was there, but it was like, how do we perform with excellence? Oh, by the way, we still got to preach good sermons and have great worship and care for people and disciple people well. And so there was this reaction, let's call it 30 to 40 years ago, to say, no. Maybe we just need to get more focused. Let's stop doing all this other stuff. The idea wasn't bad. The execution was struggling for many churches. So now what you have, it was already happening pre-COVID with the cost of building and construction and things like that. Churches were going, how do we engage our community? How do we meet real needs in the community? Not create needs, not say, well, we already have a coffee bar in our lobby for Sunday. Let's open a coffee shop. Well, no. Is there a need for a coffee shop? Is there a need for childcare? So people started to wrestle with that. And then as we know with COVID, it accelerated a lot of the things that people were already wrestling with. So now suddenly 2020, 2021, auditoriums were less full, buildings were less active than ever before. And churches are going, there's got to be a better way to steward this. So now you're seeing this resurgence, and we've got to figure out multi-use from a stewardship standpoint, a community impact standpoint. Let's do something with this. But what's typically happened in the past and continues to be the struggle right now is elder boards and executive leadership teams keep talking about it, but they're trying to figure out, how do I take that next step? And it ends up falling in one of two categories, Tony, every single time. Either a senior pastor says, we're doing it, and then they just got to go figure it out. And so there's that, or there's the every 3 months we're going to talk about it, but we don't really know the next step with childcare or next step with events. So it gets kicked down the road, and we'll talk about it again a few months from now. That's the pattern that we're currently seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that pattern related to senior pastors too, just saying we're going to do it and figure it out later. You're helping churches think about maybe more intentionally how to do multi-use strategy. We're usually coming in to pick up the pieces when they've taken that attitude with multi-site. So I can share the pain and the opportunity in that. But what are some of the most interesting or creative ideas you've seen churches trying out?
Yeah, I'm going to put aside some of the weirder ideas. So I'm not going to go the weird. I'm going to go interesting, okay? Because there's some weird stuff out there that may not be helpful for this group. But here's what I like seeing. I love seeing people take an idea that seems to fit and kind of make it their own. So co-working right now as a nation, the co-working model is iffy. Right? I mean, we see it thriving in some areas like Rome is doing great stuff in Atlanta area here. They're awesome. Some people got it figured out, and then some are failing or struggling. And so what's your value proposition? I'm seeing some churches really do co-working, but it's really like a nonprofit incubator space. So they're gathering nonprofits together to share their conference rooms, their copying machines. They're all contributing a little bit toward the payment of the lease or rent or whatever. But what they're doing is doing shared space with ideas, with marketing strategies, with fundraising ideas. So bringing nonprofits together. Love that idea. I mean, that's going really well for a handful. So it's not solidified. It's not perfect yet, but I'm seeing some churches really excel at that. Say, get rid of your offices. Let's all get together and let's use this space. So love seeing that. The education space, churches are taking all different kinds of approaches. Right now, we're in a childcare crisis. We'll probably talk about that a little bit more later on. But so early learning development is like low hanging fruit if you can do it right. But then also we're seeing churches explore K through 12 again, because there's huge opportunity there, growth all over the nation with that for Christian education, private education, certainly in states like North Carolina and Florida, where voucher systems are now coming on to make it easier or more accessible for that. So it's not rocket science, but it's good. I will say that some people are confusing multi-use space, and they're having tenants in their space and calling that multi-use. So if you're a church and you buy a shopping center and you have your auditorium and you have it all built out, and at the end you have leftover space and you rent that to somebody, that is not multi-use. The word itself is different people using the same space, right? That is a tenant arrangement. That is smart. That is, in my opinion, not multi-use. Multi-use is we're having to flip this space. So the same thing that's children's ministry on Sunday is preschool during the week. So it's that kind of thinking. Okay. And that's where most people are wrestling and defining multi-use. They're going, okay, there's landlord, there's stewardship of land, property, facilities. Great. We can have a tenant that we're not sharing space. And then multi-use is really more of that lane of shared space. Different things with sports. But I'll tell you what I'm loving about sports right now isn't let's take sports and make them Christian. Those are being moderately successful at best. But what we are seeing is people that are going to their city and their mayor and going, what's the need? And the mayor's going, we need indoor soccer fields or whatever. How can we partner together and use that for your youth ministry space on the weekend, but give us somewhere to go during the winter months because we have no land to work with. So approaching the city and doing something that's truly multi-use. And once again, not just allocating land for something and letting it be something different, but being like, let's share this space. How do we get creative? We have city mayors and leaders saying we'd love to partner because we don't have the capital, but we have the need based on the growth or whatever's happening.
Yeah, and I've actually seen this play out with your location here in Atlanta, where when I've been there during the week, the entire property is being used with events and co-working and the childcare. And then the church moves in on the weekend and is using all the space as well. So I love that distinction of being a tenant and actually having true multi-use space. So along these lines, Frank, could you share some of the best practices in multi-use space that church leaders need to be aware of?
Yeah, for sure. One of those is when you're exploring multi-use, there's truly this issue of space optimization. It's not just if you already have a building or you're wanting to do some minor renovations, just going, well, we have kids' rooms, let's turn it into a child development center. Knocking down one wall, adding one sink could be a game changer to the business model of the child development center and the impact that you can have. But what a lot of churches do is I love the idea of thinking inside the box, our limitations and not being, so dreamy that it's unrealistic. But at the same time, sometimes they're taking their space and they don't have the vision to see how minor modifications with minor investment could have massive impact, both financially in a good way and or from an impact standpoint. And so, just that idea of going, okay, how do we see this differently? We all watch, or many people watch HGTV and watch those house flipping shows. And we're blown away by how these people can walk in and see, I need to knock down this wall. I need to do this. I need to do this. And wow, look what comes out of it. Because most of us are not wired that way. We don't have the gift. We can figure out how to decorate our current space. Maybe I can't, but other people can decorate and put paint on the wall and whatnot. But minor changes can make a massive difference to the flow and experience in a home. The same is true for your church building. And so oftentimes when we start thinking multi-use, one of those words of caution, one of the things that we have to figure out and find the best way to do it is when we go to an architect, they're great at helping us make sure we meet international building code and some high level vision of the space. They can do some great renderings. Does not mean that's optimized for business use. And so there may be some inefficiencies here. I literally went to a church where their ice machine was on the other side and around the counter. So they started serving iced coffee and literally they had to exit the coffee area and go around to basically get ice every single time they needed it. And it was like, okay, or you could just cut the counter. And I was at a church and I just said, hey, I don't think this would cost you that much. And you would have thought that I'd shared like the greatest idea ever of just like cut a hole in the counter. And we're like, oh, of course we'd see that. When it's your own space and you're a church leader, you have a hard time seeing those things sometimes when you get familiar with the space. So that's one of the things. The other thing is when it comes to the business side, if you're thinking about doing co-working, you're thinking about doing child development, you're thinking about doing events, what kind of business assessment and pro forma are you pulling together before you make the decision? It's not enough to have the space and want it to be used differently based on some anecdotal statements that were made that one time about, oh yeah, I can't find anywhere to enroll my kid in school. We need to open a child development center. You need somebody coming in going, no, here's where this works. Here's where this doesn't work. Here's the opportunities. Here's the problem with what you have here. And vice versa when it comes to events or co-working or coffee shop. What are those opportunities and threats to really assess and figure out the business model for a coffee shop? How many cups of coffee do you have to sell to pay for the barista and pay for the space? I can't tell you the number of churches that I've talked to, and it's more than I can count on my fingers and toes. I know I'm from Tennessee and I keep things simple, but it's a lot that literally decided to open a coffee shop before they knew how many cups of coffee they had to sell to break even.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why I love, Frank, that you're coming alongside pastors and church leaders, because I've seen, especially with coffee shops, that same mistake where they just haven't done the math to figure out, can we actually cash flow this? And frankly, I think in some instances, it's okay to say we're never going to make money here. It just adds to the experience we're trying to create for people in our facilities. But it would be good to know that going in, wouldn't it? Are there any major mistakes you've seen churches make that our listeners should be aware of?
Yes. I'll narrow it down to one. There are all kinds of things that we could obviously do better, but there is one prevailing problem that is happening over and over and over again, no matter if it's coffee or school or whatever it is, that is the number one problem with this by far. And I'll use education for an example, but it applies to any, okay? It is placing Aunt Susie that loves the church and is really good with kids over the early learning development center. Okay, so we're going to take a preschool. We're going to open a preschool that has $1.5 million a year in revenue, 40 staff members. They got to deal with workers' compensation and liability insurance and marketing strategy and all that. And well, Aunt Susie one time worked at a preschool and she's really good with kids and we know we can trust her. Well, that's not the way to look at it. If it's a business unit, you can't have somebody that worked at a place that one time and loves Jesus and loves the church to make that thrive and excel. There's got to be some kind of leadership infrastructure, some kind of support. You may still be able to hire Aunt Susie that is a great face of the preschool, but you need somebody else to help with the marketing and the business ops and the strategy. Same with coffee. Just because somebody can brew a great cup of coffee doesn't mean they know how to market and get people to come in the door and how they can really focus on that 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. window and then that 2 to 4 lull. How are they strategically hitting those times and not just, well, I'll brew coffee for whoever shows up. That's not going to thrive, right? Same with events. In the event space, what you see churches do is they're like, yeah, we see a need for events. We could rent our auditorium. So we have people call all the time. Well, that in and of itself is not a true statement. We've had people call. It would be a more accurate statement. Right. So what do we do for our event strategy? We put pricing and we put a point of contact inside our church. And now we have an event business. No, you don't. You most likely have something that's causing a lot of frustration for your staff that's not profitable because it's not paying rent, it's not paying utilities, it may be covering expenses. So you've activated your space more, frustrated some people along the way, and you are constantly as a leadership team having to decide if you're going to allow this event or that event. That's not a business strategy. That's somebody that knows how to put on an event, has been assigned this responsibility. That's the big mistake that people make, and then they can't figure out why it doesn't thrive financially or have the level of community engagement they originally intended.
So Frank, given all of this experience now that you have related to Phase, where do you hope this trend is going as far as multi-use space?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's about improved stewardship and greater community impact. And the only way we can assess that is to say from now on, when it comes to multi-use, we are going to have clear goals and objectives. We, the church, are going to have clear goals and objectives of what we want to see happening in our child development center or in our coffee shop from the front end. How do we want to see community engagement? How do we define that? Is that the amount of activity, the amount of new people coming through our doors, the number of meetings that are happening in our coffee shop, and revenue? Okay, how is this bringing in revenue? Are we supplementing this out of tithes and offerings? If so, for how long? And what's our business plan to stop that from happening in the future and let it actually fund some ministry? Oftentimes, what we see is that I've talked to churches that say they're profitable in the area of childcare, but then when I press in, that childcare center isn't covering rent or utilities or anything. It's just as a separate unit with the costs associated with it, not losing money. And that's probably not the right assessment. And so what I hope the trend is to say there's an opportunity to meet real needs in the community, to have massive impact, but we've got to do it in a way that's excellent and professional. And so that requires us to have standards and systems and processes just like we would in the church world.
All right, Frank, as we wrap up this conversation, any advice that you'd like to give to a church that currently has great space, but limited functionality when it comes to how they might be more creative and reimagine how they could use that asset in the future? Any advice you could offer?
Yeah, absolutely. At the end of the day, it's get some strategic partners along the way that know the space you're wanting to explore. If you're wanting to have a child development center, don't just look around your congregation and say, does anybody happen to one time worked in a preschool? Let's find somebody, Phase would love to help, but find somebody that would come in and assess your site and evaluate the opportunities and threats with the facilities and what's there. Have somebody count every coffee shop that's within a certain distance and go, why are they coming here? What's the difference? And have somebody that has opened 3 coffee shops in your area come say, why would you or wouldn't you open a coffee shop where I'm at? Have that outside expert giving a fresh perspective. It's not enough to have the space. That is a blessing. But just like we see the parable of the talents, you can have the space and you can go multiply that. You can multiply those talents, or you can stick them in the ground. Sometimes when we're like, well, let's just keep it to ourselves. Let's ideate a little bit. That's not multiplying anything. We're just creating a false sense of activity. What we want to do is go, how can we multiply this talent? How can we really do something great with it? This thing that has value, let's make it have more value. I don't know that we can do that by just kicking around ideas internally. We've got to get some outside insight and help.